Vi starts with a man finding an old, torn teddy bear and putting it in a bag. He's looking around for things and picks up a metal bar, also putting it in the bag. After closing the bag, he slings it over his shoulder and leaves the building, walking past a person lying on the floor. As Paul walks through the streets, we hear explosions, sirens, and gunfire. The world around him is falling apart, and he's trying to escape what seems like the end of the world. Eventually, he reaches the woods. He finds a hiding spot where there are two babies, Paul's twin sons. The kids are upset, but Paul comforts them, promising that things will get better. 15 years later, Paul and his teenage sons, Joseph and Thomas, live in a lonely farmhouse. We see Paul and Joseph at home, while Thomas is playing in the woods, leaping over a cave. Paul waits outside anxiously while Joseph secures the house by covering the windows and doors. When Thomas finally arrives, Paul scolds him for being late, and they all go inside. After finishing boarding up the doors and windows, they move to an upper floor and sit down at the dinner table. Paul warns Thomas that if he's late again, he won't be allowed to go beyond the boundaries of their property. Thomas explains that he was helping Mr. Rose at the Rose Farm, but Paul's decision stands. Dinner goes on, but the boys start arguing and their dad separates them. That night, while the brothers are playing chess, their dog, Rocco, starts behaving strangely. Thomas and Paul go to investigate, and they hear loud banging at the door. They hold the door together until the banging stops. Thomas is impulsive and daring, while Joseph is more thoughtful and intellectual. Joseph analyzes the situation and tries to explain who might have been at the door. They tried 3 times, first as a test, then a real attempt to break the door, and finally out of frustration. The next morning, Paul finds deep scratches on the door and discovers it's infested with bugs. Thomas asks if he can go beyond the boundaries, but Paul tells him to finish chopping wood first. Joseph becomes frustrated with his dad for always giving in to Thomas. Paul goes to the barn, where Joseph is tinkering with the ATV. Paul asks Joseph to show him what he's been up to. Joseph explains he's trying to improve their situation by fixing up the ATV for better transportation, but he's struggling to get it working. Paul makes some adjustments, and the ATV starts up. The 3 of them hop into the car, and Paul teaches Joseph how to drive, explaining how the pedals work. After the lesson, Thomas wants to venture outside the boundaries again, but Paul suggests they go to the river and gather wood with his brother to reinforce the window covers instead. Thomas argues that he wants to go to Rose Farm, but Paul insists he can go tomorrow. In the car on their way to the river for wood, Thomas complains about being stuck with Joseph's bad driving, as he's supposed to supervise him during his learning stage as per their dad's instructions. Joseph insists he doesn't need help. Thomas then gets an idea and sneaks out of the ATV once they're out of their dad's sight. Thomas tells Joseph they'll meet later at the same spot, just before sunset, and head home together. Then he dashes through the woods again, crossing the same cave, and reaches Rose Farm. There, he's welcomed by Mr. and Mrs. Rose, and he bumps into Charlotte, whom he secretly likes. Meanwhile, Paul repairs and strengthens the scratched door, while Joseph heads to the port on an abandoned ship to scavenge for wood. Thomas enjoys his time with Charlotte, goofing around and having fun. However, he loses track of time and realizes he's been there too long. He promises to return and Charlotte hugs him before he leaves. Meanwhile, Paul begins to worry as the sun sets. The ATV won't start, but Joseph manages to fix it by adjusting the relays. Thomas rushes through the woods to the agreed meeting spot but stumbles and falls into a cave, losing consciousness. Joseph waits for Thomas at the spot, but when he doesn't show up, Joseph returns home without him. He tells his dad about Thomas going to Rose Farm. Paul instructs Joseph to lock the house and goes out to search for Thomas. Meanwhile, Thomas wakes up in the cave as Paul and Rocco search for him. Thomas explores the cave, using his magnesium lighter for light, and encounters a strange creature. Paul hears the creature's screeches, rushes to the scene, and finds Thomas on the ground, defending himself with a pocket knife. Thomas stabs one creature's hand and tries to retreat, but another creature grabs his face. As Thomas struggles, Paul arrives and saves him by stabbing the creature. Thomas explains to his dad that he fell accidentally and hit his head. Paul rushes to him, hugs him, and asks if he's alright. Realizing they'll have to spend the night there, Paul suggests they block the cave entrance. Meanwhile, back at home, Joseph fails to properly lock the door. Exhausted, he falls asleep in a chair. Suddenly, the door shakes, and the cover of the unlocked giant peephole opens. A creature reaches its arm into the room, but despite its effort, it can't reach Joseph. It opens the door and stares at him. As the creature enters, Joseph traps it. It turns out Joseph was awake and planned to catch the creature to study it. Meanwhile, back at the cave, the creatures block the exit, trapping Paul and Thomas inside. They manage to get to them by digging underground. Paul detonates an explosive to fend off their attackers but injures himself severely in the explosion. The next morning, Joseph arrives in the woods with the ATV. He finds Thomas and Paul, relieved to see they survived, but Paul is unconscious with a badly injured arm. They load him onto the ATV and take him home. Later, Thomas enters Joseph's room and notices a cage covered with a cloth. Joseph explains how he caught the creature to Thomas. Meanwhile, Thomas bandages Paul's wounds, and the brothers discuss their encounters with the creatures. They mention killing some of them, and Thomas reveals that he learned from Mr. and Mrs. Rose that the creatures no longer visit the Rose farm. Together, they decide to enter the room and kill the trapped creature. Joseph then takes the creature's body to the barn and dissects it. Thomas suggests taking Paul to Rose farm, believing they have better medicine and facilities. Joseph doubts they'll help but reluctantly agrees to give it a try. They load Paul onto the ATV and head to Rose farm. Thomas speaks to Mr. and Mrs. Rose, but they refuse to spare any medicine and decline to take in Paul. Charlotte stands up for them, but Mrs. Rose shuts her down. Mrs. Rose offers Thomas to stay with them and provide supplies for Joseph and Paul. However, Thomas and Joseph decide to leave. During their walk, Joseph blames Thomas for Paul's condition, and they end up fighting. Joseph leaves without Thomas. Thomas enters Rose farm alone, where Mr. Rose apologizes for their decision. Charlotte brings him inside, offers him food, and encourages him to eat. She then takes him to her room, where they talk and share a kiss before Mr. Rose interrupts. He gets angry and tells Charlotte to leave, then he exits as well. Meanwhile, Joseph is driving back home when he notices many sheep running around wildly. Arriving home, Joseph notices strange marks on the ground. He brings his dad inside the house, then heads to the barn to inspect the ground, worried that the creatures might dig underneath the house. Meanwhile, at Rose farm, Charlotte discovers Thomas snooping around. He explains he can't stay because his dad is injured and asks Charlotte to give him the medicine. A man from Rose farm, Hobson, eavesdrops from outside as Charlotte gives Thomas the medicine. After Thomas hugs her and prepares to leave, Hobson confronts him at gunpoint, questioning why he's stealing. Meanwhile, back at the house, Joseph is fortifying windows and doors when he discovers a tunnel hidden under a carpet. At Rose farm, Hobson escorts Thomas to a barn where other men are gathered. They tie Thomas up and blast loud music while Hobson aims his shotgun at him. Just as Hobson is about to shoot, he's dragged underground by the creatures, who have launched an attack on Rose farm. Mr. Rose prepares to go outside but is ambushed by a creature. As he falls, his candle sets the house on fire. Mrs. Rose attempts to flee, only to be attacked by another creature. Charlotte, concerned, ventures out to investigate. Following blood trails, she encounters a creature. In the barn, the creatures assault the people, but Thomas manages to free himself. As a creature approaches him, Charlotte arrives just in time to shoot it. Thomas witnesses both houses being destroyed and rushes to save Mr. and Mrs. Rose, but Charlotte sadly informs him they're gone. Back at the house, Joseph blocks the creature's tunnel by barricading it with furniture and other items. He hears a voice at the door and cautiously approaches. Suddenly, the cover of the peephole slides open, but instead of a creature, a human hand appears. It's Thomas and Charlotte, and Joseph lets them in. Thomas hands him the medicine, and they bond once again as brothers in arms. Their dad wakes up, and they administer the medicine to him. Joseph informs him about the creatures having dug under the house. Paul encourages them to fight back. They gather supplies from the barn and head back to the house. Joseph instructs Thomas to buy him some time while he prepares something. Thomas and Charlotte immediately get to work, boarding up the doors to fortify the house. Joseph gathers furniture and other items, dousing them with gasoline and using a burning cigarette as a trigger. Meanwhile, Thomas and Charlotte are ambushed by creatures, but they successfully defeat two of them. Joseph instructs them to lure the creatures into the house. As Paul wakes up and joins the fight, he grabs a bat and stands guard at the door, facing off against numerous creatures. Meanwhile, Joseph sets up a box as a bunker to shield himself from the explosion. As a creature nearly overpowers Paul, the brothers rush in and eliminate it. They head to the room with the container box, where Paul locks the door behind them. He chooses to stay behind, facing the creatures alone, so his sons have a better chance of survival. In a poignant moment, Paul has a flashback to holding his sons 15 years ago, reflecting on the bond they share. Joseph pounds on the door, desperately calling out to his dad, but Thomas insists they have to leave. They climb into the box just as a horde of creatures swarms the room. Suddenly, an explosion rips through the house, obliterating it. The siblings emerge from the box and hop into the ATV, with Thomas taking the wheel as Joseph guides him. Despite some creatures being burned but still alive, they give chase. After driving for a while, the creatures eventually perish. With the threat gone, the siblings take a moment to appreciate the starry sky. The next day, when they return home, Thomas suggests rebuilding, but Joseph proposes building something entirely new instead. They bury their parents and mourn their loss together. When Thomas asks what they should do next, Joseph suggests searching for other survivors. He instructs Thomas to drive, and the three of them hop into the car and speed away, with their loyal dog Rocco running behind them.
Make sure to subscribe and hit the notification button so that you will not miss any of our video updates.